Margaret Whitmore's empire crumbled in an instant. Not her billions, not her corporations, but the fortress she'd built around her heart. In a small-town diner, a young waitress wore a locket that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. The same delicate silver chain Margaret had clasped around her daughter's neck 40 years ago, before the accident that stole everything, before the guilt that built walls money couldn't breach. The girl smiled, unaware she carried Margaret's greatest treasure and deepest wound. Subscribe to discover how a forgotten memory will shatter two lives and rebuild them into something beautiful. Margaret Whitmore's Bentley purred to a stop outside Rosie's diner, its pristine black paint reflecting the faded neon sign like a mirror of two different worlds. The leather seats, worth more than most people's annual salaries, suddenly felt suffocating against her aged skin. She had driven here herself, dismissing her chauffeur with the same cold efficiency that had built her empire, seeking something she couldn't name in the anonymity of a roadside establishment. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and grease from the kitchen, a combination that stirred memories she'd spent decades burying beneath layers of success and solitude. Her arthritic fingers gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the mahogany wood, as she stared at the humble building that seemed to mock her wealth with its honest simplicity. The diner's interior embraced her with warmth she hadn't felt in her mansion's marble halls, where every surface echoed with the hollow sound of her footsteps. Red vinyl booths cracked with age lined the windows, their imperfections telling stories of countless meals shared between people who understood the value of simple pleasures. The black and white checkered floor bore scuff marks from work boots and sneakers, evidence of lives lived without the burden of endless zeros in bank accounts. Margaret chose a corner booth, her designer coat feeling absurdly out of place among the honest wear of the other patrons. The coffee-stained menu trembled slightly in her hands, not from age, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being somewhere her money couldn't buy her special treatment, where she was just another customer seeking sustenance for both body and soul. The morning rush had settled into a gentle hum of conversation, punctuated by the sizzle of bacon on the grill and the comforting clink of ceramic mugs against saucers. Margaret found herself listening to fragments of other people's lives. A farmer discussing crop yields, a young mother planning her child's birthday party, an elderly couple sharing comfortable silence over their shared newspaper. These were the connections she'd traded for boardroom victories and stock portfolios, the human warmth she'd sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had everything and nothing, whose success had become a golden cage that kept her isolated from the very experiences that made life meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who could buy this entire town, envied the contentment of people who worried about paying their electric bills. A movement near the kitchen caught her attention, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat as a young woman emerged, carrying a coffee pot, her smile genuine and unguarded in a way Margaret hadn't seen in decades. The waitress moved with natural grace, her auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows, and there was something achingly familiar about the curve of her cheek, the way she tilted her head when listening to customers. Margaret's heart began to race with a rhythm she hadn't felt since her daughter was alive, since before the accident that had torn her world apart and left her drowning in guilt and grief. The girl couldn't be more than 26, with eyes that sparkled with kindness and a laugh that seemed to bubble up from some inexhaustible well of joy. Margaret found herself studying every detail, searching for something she couldn't quite name, a recognition that danced just beyond the edges of her consciousness. The waitress approached her table with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin, her uniform clean but worn, speaking of honest work and dignity in simplicity. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that made Margaret's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'm Emily, and I'll be taking care of you today. Can I start you off with some coffee?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice, watching as Emily poured the steaming liquid with practiced ease. There was something in the girl's manner, a gentleness that reminded Margaret of her daughter Sarah, of quiet mornings when the world was full of possibility and love seemed infinite. The coffee cup warmed Margaret's hands, but it was Emily's presence that began to thaw something frozen deep within her chest, something she'd thought permanently lost to time and tragedy. As Emily moved away to tend to other customers, Margaret found herself unable to look away, drawn by an invisible thread she couldn't understand or explain. The girl's laughter floated across the diner like music, and Margaret realized she was witnessing something precious. A young woman who had found joy in simple things, who treated every customer like family, who possessed the kind of natural warmth that no amount of money could buy. Margaret's empire had been built on reading people, on understanding what drove them, but Emily was different, transparent in her goodness, uncomplicated in her happiness. The observation filled Margaret with a bittersweet longing for the person she might have been if grief hadn't hardened her heart into something resembling stone. Subscribe to witness the moment when past and present collide in ways that will forever change two souls. Emily returned to Margaret's table with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being, her steps light and purposeful as she navigated between the scattered chairs and busy tables. The morning light streaming through the diner's windows caught something at her throat, a glint of silver that made Margaret's breath catch and her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. It was delicate, almost hidden beneath the collar of Emily's uniform, but unmistakably there, a locket that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Margaret's vision blurred as 40 years collapsed into a single, devastating moment of recognition, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what she was seeing. The locket was identical to the one she had given her daughter Sarah on her 16th birthday, the one that had been buried with her after the accident, the one that existed now only in Margaret's most treasured and painful memories. The silver chain caught the light as Emily leaned forward to refill Margaret's cup, and Margaret could see the intricate engravings that she remembered tracing with her finger all those years ago. The delicate rose pattern, the tiny leaves that curved around the edges, the almost imperceptible scratch near the clasp where Sarah had dropped it on the bathroom tile. Every detail was exactly as Margaret remembered, as if time had folded in on itself and brought the past rushing back with devastating clarity. Her hands began to tremble, not with age, but with the overwhelming surge of emotions she'd spent decades suppressing. Memories that crashed over her like waves against a crumbling seawall. The diner around her seemed to fade into background noise as her entire world narrowed to that small piece of silver that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet hung there as real and solid as the grief that had shaped her life. Emily's voice seemed to come from very far away as she asked about Margaret's order, her concern evident as she noticed the older woman's sudden pallor and the way her hands shook against the table's surface. Margaret tried to speak, to form words that would make sense of the chaos in her mind, but her throat felt constricted by the weight of recognition and disbelief. The locket swayed gently as Emily moved, catching the light in ways that transported Margaret back to lazy Sunday mornings when Sarah would wear it while making pancakes, the silver catching the kitchen light as she laughed at her own jokes. Those had been the golden days, before ambition consumed Margaret's time, before the distance grew between them, before the night when everything shattered beyond repair. The memory of their last argument echoed in Margaret's mind, harsh words about priorities and love, words she would give everything to take back. "Are you all right, Mum?" Emily's voice carried genuine concern, her hand hovering near Margaret's shoulder with the instinct to comfort that seemed as natural to her as breathing. Margaret looked up into eyes that were startlingly familiar, the same shade of green that had looked back at her from Sarah's face, the same flecks of gold that had sparkled when her daughter laughed. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable now that Margaret was truly looking, seeing past her own assumptions and the barriers her grief had erected. Emily's bone structure, the way she held her head, even the unconscious gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear, all of it whispered of connections that defied logic and explanation. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as possibilities she didn't dare voice began to take shape in her mind, hope and fear warring in her chest like opposing armies. The locket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as Emily waited patiently for Margaret's response, her kindness evident in every line of her face. Margaret realized that this young woman, this stranger who wore her daughter's jewelry and carried her daughter's grace, was treating her with the same gentle care she might show to her own grandmother. The irony was almost too much to bear, that Margaret, who had spent years isolated by her wealth and guilt, should find such tenderness from someone who might hold the key to her deepest mystery. Emily's presence was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, illuminating corners of Margaret's heart that had been dark for so long she'd forgotten they existed. The simple act of being seen, truly seen, by someone who asked for nothing in return was more valuable than all the gold in Margaret's vaults. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper, rough with emotion and the weight of unspoken questions. "Your locket," she managed, the words feeling foreign on her tongue after so many years of careful control and measured responses. "It's beautiful. May I ask where you got it?" Emily's hand moved instinctively to her throat, her fingers closing around the silver pendant with a gesture that was both protective and unconscious, as if the locket was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. The question seemed to surprise her, and Margaret watched as a shadow of something, sadness perhaps or longing, flickered across her features before being replaced by her characteristic warmth. Subscribe to discover the story behind the locket that will unravel decades of secrets and transform two lives forever. Emily's fingers lingered on the locket, her touch reverent and protective, as she considered Margaret's question with the careful deliberation of someone who had been asked this before. The silver seemed to warm under her touch, as if responding to some deep connection that transcended mere ownership, and Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for words that might either shatter her world or rebuild it entirely. The diner's ambient noise faded into a distant hum as Emily's expression grew thoughtful, her eyes taking on a faraway quality that spoke of memories both cherished and painful. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing across the young woman's features, the desire to share warring with some deeper instinct to protect whatever secrets the locket held. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross, heavy with the weight of unspoken possibilities and the fear of what truth might bring. "I've had it since I was a baby," Emily said finally, her voice soft with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred things, her fingers still tracing the familiar patterns etched into the silver surface. "My adoptive parents said it was the only thing that came with me from the foster system, the only connection I have to whoever I was before." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each syllable confirming what her heart had already begun to suspect, while her mind reeled with the implications. Emily's story unfolded with the devastating simplicity of truth. A child lost in the system, raised by loving strangers who had given her everything except the answers she craved about her origins. Margaret's vision blurred as she imagined her granddaughter, Sarah's daughter, growing up without knowing her family, without understanding the legacy of love that should have been her birthright. The guilt that had haunted Margaret for decades suddenly took on new dimensions, expanding to encompass not just her daughter's death, but the granddaughter she had never known existed. The locket had been Sarah's most treasured possession, a gift from Margaret on her daughter's 16th birthday, engraved with a rose pattern that had been passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women. Margaret remembered the day she had given it to Sarah, how her daughter's eyes had lit up with joy and pride at receiving something so precious, so steeped in family history and love. Sarah had worn it every day until the accident, and Margaret had insisted it be buried with her, unable to bear the sight of it without her daughter's presence to give it meaning. But now, seeing it around Emily's neck, Margaret realized that Sarah must have given it to her daughter before the accident, must have passed on this tangible piece of their family's legacy, even as her own life was cut tragically short. The thought that Sarah had been thinking of her child, protecting her heritage even in her final moments, brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes and a crushing weight of regret to her chest. Emily continued her story with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to share her pain without drowning in it, explaining how she had spent years wondering about the locket's significance, about the family who had owned it before her. She spoke of visiting jewelry stores and antique shops, hoping someone might recognize the craftsmanship or the particular style of engraving, but always coming away empty-handed and more convinced that her past was lost forever. Margaret listened with growing amazement and heartbreak, realizing that her granddaughter had been searching for her family while Margaret had been drowning in isolation and self-imposed exile from the world. The cruel irony that they had been living in the same state, breathing the same air, while remaining strangers to each other, was almost too much to bear. Emily's resilience in the face of such fundamental uncertainty spoke to a strength that Margaret recognized as distinctly Whitmore, a determination that had been passed down through generations of strong women who refused to be broken by circumstance. The young woman's eyes held a mixture of hope and resignation as she spoke about her search for identity, a combination that broke Margaret's heart while simultaneously filling it with pride for this granddaughter she was only now discovering. Emily had built a life of meaning and purpose, despite not knowing where she came from, had chosen kindness and service over bitterness and resentment, had become the kind of person Sarah would have been proud to call her daughter. Margaret could see her daughter's influence in Emily's gentle strength, in the way she treated every customer with dignity and respect, in her ability to find joy in simple moments and human connections. The realization that Sarah's love had somehow transcended death, had shaped their daughter into someone extraordinary despite the absence of family guidance, filled Margaret with a complex mixture of grief and gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. As Emily prepared to move on to other customers, Margaret felt panic rise in her chest at the thought of losing this connection before she could fully understand its implications. The locket caught the light one more time as Emily turned, and Margaret saw not just a piece of jewelry, but a bridge across decades of loss and loneliness, a chance for redemption that she had never dared to hope for. The weight of her wealth suddenly felt meaningless compared to the treasure that had been serving coffee and spreading kindness just a few feet away from her. Unaware of the legacy she carried and the grandmother who had been mourning her existence for 26 years. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her purse, her mind racing with plans and possibilities, with the desperate need to confirm what her heart already knew to be true. Subscribe to witness the moment when a billionaire's carefully constructed world crumbles to reveal the family she thought she had lost forever. Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled through her purse, her fingers searching for the one item that could bridge the impossible gap between suspicion and certainty. Buried beneath credit cards that could buy small countries and business cards from the world's most powerful people, she found what she was looking for. A small, worn photograph that she had carried for 26 years like a talisman against despair. The image showed Sarah at 18, radiant and glowing with the secret she had shared with Margaret just weeks before the accident, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, where Emily had been growing, safe and loved and wanted. Margaret's throat constricted as she remembered that day, How Sarah had been nervous but excited to tell her about the pregnancy. How they had planned to raise the baby together. How Margaret had promised to be the grandmother she had never had the chance to become. The photograph felt fragile between her fingers, as if it might crumble from the weight of all the dreams it represented, all the love that had been interrupted but never destroyed. Emily returned to check on her, and Margaret found herself studying every detail of the young woman's face with new intensity, comparing it to the image in the photograph with the desperate hope of someone who had been lost in the desert and suddenly glimpsed an oasis. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable, the same delicate bone structure, the same expressive eyes, the same unconscious grace that had made Sarah so beautiful inside and out. Emily's smile was Sarah's smile, warm and genuine and capable of lighting up the darkest corners of any room, and Margaret felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously as she recognized her daughter's legacy living and breathing before her. The years fell away as Margaret saw Sarah in Emily's gestures, heard her daughter's laugh in Emily's voice, felt the presence of the family she had thought was lost forever. The realization that she was looking at her granddaughter, her own flesh and blood, filled Margaret with a joy so intense it was almost painful, a happiness she had never expected to feel again. "Emily," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, the name feeling sacred on her lips as she spoke it with the knowledge of who this young woman truly was. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure you'll believe me. But I know, that locket belonged to my daughter." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross, heavy with implications that could change everything or destroy the fragile peace Emily had built around her unknown origins. Margaret watched as confusion and hope warred across Emily's features, saw the way her hand moved instinctively to the locket as if seeking comfort from its familiar weight. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibility and fraught with the fear that comes when long-held dreams suddenly seem within reach. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for Emily's response, knowing that the next few minutes would either reunite a family or shatter two hearts that had already endured too much pain. Emily's eyes widened as the implications of Margaret's words began to sink in, her face cycling through disbelief, hope, and a desperate kind of hunger that Margaret recognized as the same longing that had driven her own search for meaning in the years since Sarah's death. "Your daughter," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of a question she had been asking her entire life, the possibility that she might finally have an answer to the mystery of her origins. Margaret nodded, pulling out the photograph with hands that shook not from age, but from the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. The secret that could transform both their lives in ways neither had dared to imagine. The image of Sarah, young and pregnant and glowing with maternal love, seemed to pulse with life as Margaret held it out to Emily, offering not just a picture but a piece of the past that had been missing from both their lives. Emily's breath caught as she looked at the photograph, her free hand moving to cover her mouth as she saw her own features reflected in the face of a woman she had never known but had been searching for all her life. The diner around them seemed to fade into insignificance as Emily stared at the photograph, her eyes filling with tears that spoke of a lifetime of wondering and hoping and dreaming about this exact moment. Margaret watched as recognition dawned in her granddaughter's face, saw the way Emily's fingers traced the edge of the photograph, as if she could somehow touch the mother she had never known through the faded image. "She was pregnant with you when this was taken," Margaret said softly, her voice thick with emotion and the weight of 26 years of grief and love and regret. "She died in a car accident when you were just a few months old, and I thought I had lost you both forever." The words came out in a rush, decades of pain and longing compressed into a few simple sentences that carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of love and loss. Emily's tears fell freely now, and Margaret felt her own composure crumbling as she reached across the table to touch her granddaughter's hand. The first physical contact between them, feeling like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. The connection between them was immediate and undeniable, a recognition that went deeper than logic or proof, a knowing that came from the heart rather than the mind. Emily's hand was warm under Margaret's touch, and the older woman could feel the pulse of life that connected them across the years of separation and loss, the blood tie that had survived tragedy and time, and the cruel randomness of fate. Margaret looked into Emily's eyes and saw not just her granddaughter, but her daughter's legacy, the continuation of a love story that death had interrupted but never truly ended. The locket caught the light between them, no longer just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of the unbreakable bonds that connect families across time and space and circumstance. Subscribe to discover how this miraculous reunion will transform two broken hearts into something beautiful and whole. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with decades of unspoken pain. Margaret's weathered hands trembling as she reached toward the locket that had haunted her dreams for 26 years. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her fingers instinctively moving to protect the precious pendant that had been her only connection to a mother she'd never known, the metal warm against her palm from years of faithful wearing. The afternoon light streaming through the diner's windows seemed to pause, suspended in this moment of recognition that would shatter everything both women thought they knew about their lives. Margaret's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, traced every delicate curve of the locket's surface, seeing not just the present moment, but the ghost of her daughter's young hands clasping it around her neck on her 18th birthday. The weight of lost time pressed down upon them both, heavy as stone, as Emily struggled to comprehend how this elegant stranger could know the most intimate details of her most treasured possession. Margaret's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper that carried the accumulated sorrow of a quarter-century of searching, of hoping, of never quite giving up on a miracle that seemed impossible until this very moment. The other diners continued their conversations, oblivious to the earth-shifting revelation unfolding in the corner booth, while Emily felt her world tilt on its axis as she stared into eyes that held the same shade of green as her own reflection. Margaret's fingers hovered just inches from the locket, not quite daring to touch what she had mourned as lost forever, her voice breaking as she whispered the story that had carved itself into her soul like a wound that never healed. She spoke of her daughter Sarah, brilliant and headstrong, who had fallen in love with a man Margaret deemed unworthy, leading to arguments that escalated into ultimatums and finally the terrible silence of estrangement. The locket had been Sarah's grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women, each one adding their own small scratches and dents to its surface until it became a map of their shared history. Margaret's tears fell freely now as she described the last time she saw her daughter, pregnant and defiant, walking away from the family mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back and that precious locket around her neck. She had been too proud to follow, too certain that Sarah would return when she realized her mistake, too blinded by her own stubborn will to see that love should have mattered more than pride. The years had passed like a slow torture, each birthday and holiday a reminder of her failure, each private investigator's report another dead end in her desperate search for the daughter who had vanished into the vastness of America. Emily listened with growing wonder and terror, her hand pressed against the locket as if it might anchor her to this impossible reality, her mind racing to connect the dots between this stranger's story and the fragments of her own past. The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow, stealing her breath as she realized that the woman sitting across from her wasn't just any grieving mother, but the grandmother she had dreamed about in countless lonely nights at the orphanage. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she described the endless search, the teams of investigators, the false leads that had taken her across continents and through decades of disappointment. All while Emily had been growing up just 3 states away, wearing the very clue that could have brought them together. The irony was almost unbearable that Margaret's vast fortune, her connections, her resources had all failed to find what chance had delivered to her on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a small-town diner. Emily's mind reeled with questions about her mother, about the circumstances that had led to her death when Emily was barely 2 years old, about the father she had never known and the family history that had been stolen from her by tragedy and pride. Margaret reached into her purse with shaking hands, withdrawing a photograph so worn from handling that its edges had gone soft, showing a young woman with Emily's exact features, wearing the same locket that now hung around Emily's neck. The resemblance was so striking that several nearby diners glanced over, sensing something momentous in the charged atmosphere that surrounded their table. Emily stared at the photograph of her mother, seeing her own face reflected in features that time had preserved in silver and sepia, while Margaret watched her granddaughter's expression with a mixture of joy and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Margaret's voice took on the cadence of confession as she revealed the depths of her regret, how her pride and prejudice had cost her not just her daughter, but the granddaughter she had never known existed until this moment. She spoke of the empty nursery that had remained untouched in her mansion for 26 years, decorated in soft yellows and greens because she had never known whether Sarah's baby would be a boy or a girl. The wealth that had seemed so important, the social standing she had tried to protect, all of it felt meaningless now in the face of Emily's presence. This living proof that love had found a way to survive even the cruelest separations. Emily felt the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her as she absorbed the magnitude of what she was learning. That she wasn't truly alone in the world. That somewhere there had always been someone searching for her. Someone who would have loved her if only they had known where to look. Margaret's hands shook as she described the guilt that had eaten away at her for decades, the knowledge that her stubbornness had robbed her of precious years with her daughter, and had left her granddaughter to grow up without family, without the love and security that should have been her birthright. The locket seemed to pulse with warmth against Emily's chest, as if it were a living thing that had been waiting all these years to fulfill its purpose as a bridge between past and present. Margaret's tears fell onto the worn photograph as she traced her daughter's face with one trembling finger, seeing Sarah's spirit alive and vibrant in Emily's eyes, feeling the miracle of second chances settling around them like grace. The diner around them seemed to fade into insignificance as Emily struggled to process the enormity of what she was learning, her entire identity shifting like sand beneath her feet as she realized that the story she had told herself about being unwanted and alone had been built on incomplete information. Margaret's voice grew urgent as she explained how the private investigators had lost Sarah's trail after she moved to a different state, how the records had been sealed or lost, how bureaucracy and bad luck had conspired to keep them apart, even as they had unknowingly lived parallel lives of longing and loss. Emily's mind raced with memories of her childhood in foster care, the questions that had never been answered, the sense of incompleteness that had followed her into adulthood, despite her determination to build a life of independence and purpose. Margaret reached across the table with desperate tenderness, her fingers finally making contact with the locket that had been her beacon of hope through the darkest years of her life. Feeling the metal warm from Emily's skin and knowing that this moment was both an ending and a beginning. The weight of their shared grief seemed to lift slightly as they sat together, 2 women who had been shaped by the same loss but had never known they were mourning the same person. Emily felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of abandonment that had lived there for as long as she could remember, replaced by the overwhelming realization that she had been loved all along, just from a distance too great to bridge until now. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely as she looked into Emily's face and saw not just her granddaughter, but the redemption she had never dared to hope for. The chance to love Sarah's daughter the way she should have loved Sarah herself. Emily felt her own tears beginning to fall as she absorbed the magnitude of this woman's grief and the depth of her regret. Understanding for the first time that her mother's absence from her life hadn't been a choice, but a tragedy that had wounded more than just herself. The locket seemed to throb with significance between them, no longer just a piece of jewelry, but a talisman that had carried love across decades and miles, waiting for this moment when it could finally fulfill its purpose as a bridge between two hearts that had been broken by the same loss. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion as she whispered apologies for all the birthdays she had missed, all the scraped knees she hadn't kissed, all the bedtime stories she hadn't read. Her words carrying the weight of a grandmother's love that had been forced to exist in the abstract for far too long. Emily reached across the table and covered Margaret's weathered hand with her own young one, feeling the electric shock of connection that comes when family recognizes family, when blood calls to blood across the void of separation and time. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner windows, illuminating their joined hands and the locket that had brought them together, while around them the ordinary world continued its ordinary business, unaware that two lives were being fundamentally transformed by the power of love that refuses to be defeated by pride, time, or circumstance. Subscribe to witness how this miraculous reunion will heal wounds that have festered for decades and create a bond stronger than the forces that tried to keep them apart. The hours passed unnoticed as Margaret and Emily sat in their corner booth, the outside world fading into irrelevance while they carefully constructed a bridge across the chasm of 26 lost years. Each shared memory and revealed truth, adding another plank to the connection that was forming between them. Emily's shift had long since ended, but her manager, sensing something profound in the charged atmosphere around their table, had quietly covered her remaining tables and left them undisturbed to navigate this miraculous reunion. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she shared stories of Sarah's childhood, painting vivid pictures of a spirited little girl who had climbed every tree in their estate's vast gardens and who had once tried to give away all her birthday presents to the children at a local orphanage. Emily drank in these glimpses of her mother's personality like someone dying of thirst, finally understanding where her own fierce independence and compassionate heart had come from, seeing the genetic threads that connected her to a family history she had never known existed. Margaret's eyes sparkled with bittersweet joy as she described Sarah's love of books, her talent for painting, her stubborn streak that had been both her greatest strength and her ultimate downfall when it came to their final confrontation. The locket caught the light as Emily leaned forward, hanging on every word, her fingers unconsciously tracing its familiar surface as she learned that her mother had done the same thing whenever she was nervous or excited. Margaret pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through decades of saved voicemails that she had never been able to delete, playing Sarah's voice for Emily to hear, watching her granddaughter's face transform with wonder as she listened to the mother she had never known speak words of love and longing from beyond the grave. Emily's own stories came haltingly at first, years of self-protection making it difficult to open her heart to this stranger who was somehow family. But Margaret's patient attention and obvious love gradually drew out the details of a childhood spent in foster care and group homes. She spoke of the kind families who had tried to help her, the not-so-kind ones who had seen her as just another burden, the way she had learned to make herself small and undemanding to avoid being moved again and again. Margaret's heart broke anew with each revelation. understanding that while she had been living in luxury and mourning her losses, her granddaughter had been struggling to survive in a system that was overwhelmed and underfunded. Carrying the locket as her only connection to a family she didn't even know was searching for her. Emily described the night she had spent staring at the locket, making up stories about the woman who had owned it before her, never imagining that somewhere Margaret was staring at an empty nursery and wondering what had become of her daughter's child. The cruel irony of their parallel lives of longing was almost too much to bear, but it also made their present connection feel like a miracle that had been decades in the making. Margaret listened with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every word, her successful businesswoman's mind already racing with plans to make up for lost time, to shower Emily with all the love and opportunities that should have been hers from birth. Emily found herself relaxing into the unfamiliar warmth of unconditional acceptance, feeling walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble as she realized that this woman's love for her wasn't conditional on her performance or behavior, but was simply a given, as natural as breathing. The conversation turned to Sarah's final years, and Margaret's voice grew heavy with regret as she admitted that pride had kept her from reaching out even when her private investigators had found traces of her daughter's presence in various cities. She had always assumed that Sarah would eventually come home, that motherhood would soften her rebellious spirit and bring her back to the family fold, never imagining that tragedy would steal that opportunity forever. Emily learned that her mother had worked multiple jobs to support them both, that she had been studying to become a teacher while waitressing at night, that she had spoken often of her daughter's bright future, and her determination to give Emily everything she herself had been denied. Margaret's voice broke as she revealed that Sarah had tried to contact her just weeks before her death, leaving messages that Margaret had been too proud to return. Messages that might have led to a reconciliation that could have changed everything. The weight of that missed opportunity hung between them like a ghost, but Emily surprised them both by reaching across the table to squeeze Margaret's hand, her voice gentle as she absolved her grandmother of guilt that had been eating away at her for decades. The locket seemed to pulse with warmth between them, as if Sarah's spirit was present in this moment of forgiveness and connection, blessing the bond that was forming between the two people she had loved most in the world. Margaret felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen as she accepted Emily's grace, understanding that her granddaughter had inherited not just Sarah's stubborn streak, but also her capacity for forgiveness and love. Margaret's business instincts warred with her grandmother's heart as she struggled with how much to reveal about her wealth and status, not wanting to overwhelm Emily or make her feel like she was being bought rather than loved. Emily, for her part, was beginning to piece together clues about Margaret's financial situation from her expensive clothes, her confident bearing, and the way she had casually mentioned private investigators and decades-long searches. The revelation of Margaret's billionaire status came gradually through careful questions and gentle admissions, until Emily found herself staring across the table at one of the most powerful women in the country, a woman who had built an empire while carrying the secret wound of her lost family. Margaret watched Emily's face carefully for signs of gold-digging or sudden calculation, but saw only wonder and a touch of intimidation, the same honest reactions that had drawn her to Emily in the first place. Emily's mind reeled with the implications of this discovery, understanding that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine, but also feeling a strange sense of rightness, as if the universe was finally balancing scales that had been weighted against her for far too long. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm, as she explained that money couldn't buy back the lost years or erase the pain they had both endured, but it could provide opportunities for healing and connection that might not otherwise exist. Emily found herself thinking of all the nights she had worked double shifts just to make rent, all the dreams she had deferred because survival had to come first, all the ways that financial security might allow her to become the person she had always wanted to be, rather than just the person she needed to be to get by. The practical questions began to surface as the initial shock of recognition gave way to the reality of what came next. Margaret's organized mind, already working through the logistics of integrating Emily into her life while respecting her granddaughter's independence and autonomy. Emily felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift from solitude to family, from financial struggle to security, from anonymity to being connected to one of the most recognizable names in business. But Margaret's patient understanding helped her navigate these choppy emotional waters. They talked about Emily's job at the diner, her small apartment, her carefully constructed life of modest contentment, and how all of that might change now that she had family who wanted to be part of her world. Margaret was careful not to make assumptions or demands, understanding that Emily had spent her entire adult life making her own decisions and wouldn't welcome being managed or controlled, even with the best of intentions. Emily appreciated this respect for her autonomy, feeling that it boded well for their future relationship, but she also found herself curious about the world Margaret inhabited, the responsibilities and opportunities that came with vast wealth and influence. The locket caught the light as Emily shifted in her seat, and both women were reminded of the small miracle that had brought them together, the way fate had used a piece of family jewelry to heal wounds that had seemed permanent and irreparable. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again as she realized that Sarah had found a way to bring them together, even from beyond the grave, using the locket as a beacon to guide them to each other when the time was finally right for healing and connection. The sun was setting outside the diner windows, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to bless this moment of reunion and new beginning. While inside, Margaret and Emily continued to weave the threads of their relationship with careful words and gentle touches. Emily felt something she had never experienced before, the sense of belonging that comes from being claimed by family, from being wanted not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was, Sarah's daughter and Margaret's granddaughter. Margaret marveled at the strength and grace her granddaughter had developed despite the hardships she had faced, seeing in Emily's character the best qualities of the Whitmore women combined with the resilience that had been forged in the fires of adversity. The locket seemed to glow in the fading light, no longer a symbol of loss and separation, but a testament to love's ability to transcend time and circumstance, to create connections that survive even the most devastating separations. Emily found herself thinking of her mother differently now, not as someone who had abandoned her, but as someone who had fought to provide for her until tragedy intervened. Someone who had loved her enough to ensure she would carry a piece of family history, even if she couldn't carry the family itself. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, not the burden of guilt she had carried for so long, but the joyful responsibility of loving and supporting this remarkable young woman who had somehow thrived despite being denied the advantages that should have been her birthright. Subscribe to discover how this newfound family bond will transform both their worlds and create a legacy of love that honors Sarah's memory. 3 days after their miraculous meeting at the diner, Emily found herself standing before the imposing iron gates of the Whitmore estate, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the locket that had brought her to this moment of reckoning with a family history she was only beginning to understand. Margaret had insisted on sending a car, but Emily had chosen to drive her own modest sedan, needing the familiar comfort of her independence as she prepared to enter a world that felt as foreign as another planet, despite being her birthright. The mansion rose before her like something from a fairy tale, all soaring towers and graceful arches, surrounded by gardens that spoke of generations of careful tending and unlimited resources, making Emily acutely aware of the vast gulf between the life she had lived and the one she might have known. Margaret appeared at the front door before Emily had even parked, her face radiant with joy and nervous anticipation, dressed more casually than she had been at the diner, but still carrying herself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect and attention. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she turned off the engine, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this moment and the way it seemed to crystallize all the dreams and fears she had carried about family and belonging throughout her solitary life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the circular driveway, and Emily could see gardeners working in the distance. Their presence a reminder that this wasn't just a home, but an entire world with its own rhythms and hierarchies that she would need to learn to navigate. Margaret's smile was warm and welcoming, but Emily could see the uncertainty in her grandmother's eyes, the same questions that were plaguing her own mind about how to build a relationship across such different life experiences and expectations. Margaret led Emily through rooms that seemed to stretch on forever, each one decorated with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and impeccable taste, while Emily tried to process the reality of walking through spaces that should have been familiar from childhood, but felt like a museum dedicated to a life she had never lived. The family portraits lining the hallways showed generations of Whitmore women, their faces bearing the same strong features that Emily saw in her own reflection, making her feel simultaneously connected to and alienated from this legacy of privilege and power. Margaret's voice was soft with memory as she pointed out her own mother and grandmother, explaining the family traditions and stories that should have been passed down to Emily through bedtime tales and holiday gatherings, each revelation another reminder of all that had been lost to pride and circumstance. Emily found herself studying each painting with hungry eyes, searching for traces of her mother's face among these elegant strangers, finally finding Sarah's portrait in a place of honor near the grand staircase, her young face glowing with the same rebellious spirit that had ultimately led to her estrangement from the family. Margaret paused before her daughter's portrait, her hand reaching out to touch the frame with the same reverence Emily had always shown the locket. Both women united in their love for someone who existed now only in memory and the genetic legacy she had left behind. The house felt alive with history and secrets, each room holding stories that Emily was only beginning to understand. From the library, where Sarah had spent countless hours reading, to the music room, where she had played piano with the same passion that Emily brought to her own creative pursuits. Margaret watched Emily's face carefully as they moved through the mansion, seeing wonder and overwhelm warring in her granddaughter's expression, understanding that this introduction to her heritage needed to be gentle and gradual rather than overwhelming and demanding. The nursery that Margaret had mentioned at the diner was exactly as she had described it, a shrine to hope and loss that had remained untouched for 26 years, decorated in soft yellows and greens with a crib that had never held a baby and toys that had never been played with. Emily stood in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat as she absorbed the magnitude of her grandmother's grief and the way it had been preserved in this room, like a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper as she explained how she had come to this room every year on Emily's birthday, imagining what her granddaughter might look like, what she might be doing, whether she was happy and healthy and loved by whatever family had taken her in. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that she had never been forgotten, that somewhere in this beautiful house there had always been a space waiting for her, a grandmother who had marked every milestone even from a distance. The rocking chair by the window was worn smooth from years of Margaret sitting there, staring out at the gardens and wondering if Emily was somewhere looking at the same sky, the same stars, carrying the same questions about family and belonging that had haunted Margaret's sleepless nights. Emily moved into the room with reverent steps, her fingers trailing over the crib rail and the mobile that had been chosen with such care and love, feeling the weight of all the lullabies that had never been sung and all the bedtime stories that had never been shared. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously as she saw her granddaughter finally claim the space that had been waiting for her all these years, understanding that this moment was both an ending and a beginning for both of them. The afternoon light streaming through the nursery windows seemed to bless this reunion, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like fairy dust, making the whole scene feel magical and surreal. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she led Emily to Sarah's old bedroom, preserved exactly as it had been the day she left home, a time capsule of teenage rebellion and artistic passion that revealed new layers of Emily's mother's personality. The walls were covered with paintings and sketches that showed real talent, landscapes and portraits that captured emotion with the kind of skill that spoke of natural ability and dedicated practice, making Emily understand where her own creative instincts had come from. Sarah's books lined the shelves, everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction, many of them marked with notes and observations in handwriting that looked remarkably similar to Emily's own, another genetic thread connecting them across the years of separation. Margaret sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, her hands smoothing the coverlet that had been washed and maintained, but never slept in since her daughter's departure, her voice thick with emotion as she shared memories of late-night conversations and mother-daughter confidences that had seemed so ordinary at the time, but had become precious beyond measure in retrospect. Emily found herself drawn to Sarah's desk, where journals and letters revealed the depth of her mother's thoughts and feelings, her struggles with family expectations, and her dreams of independence and artistic fulfillment that had ultimately led to the confrontation that changed everything. Margaret watched Emily read her mother's words, seeing the recognition and understanding dawning in her granddaughter's face, as she realized that Sarah's rebellion hadn't been about rejecting love, but about claiming the right to define her own life and values. The room felt alive with Sarah's presence, as if her spirit had been waiting all these years for this moment when her mother and daughter would finally meet in the space that had been hers, surrounded by the evidence of her hopes and dreams and the love that had motivated all her choices. Emily looked up from one of Sarah's journals, her eyes bright with tears and understanding, and Margaret saw in that moment that her granddaughter had inherited not just Sarah's features, but her capacity for empathy and forgiveness, the qualities that would make their relationship possible despite all the years of separation and loss. The tour continued through rooms that revealed different aspects of the Whitmore family legacy, from the formal dining room where generations had gathered for holidays and celebrations, to the cozy breakfast nook where Margaret had eaten solitary meals for decades, each space carrying its own weight of memory and possibility. Emily found herself imagining what her life might have been like if she had grown up in these rooms, surrounded by beauty and security, and the kind of unconditional love that Margaret was offering her now. But she also felt grateful for the struggles that had shaped her character and given her the strength to appreciate this gift without taking it for granted. Margaret's pride in her granddaughter was evident in every glance and gesture, the way she watched Emily's reactions and responses, clearly delighted by her intelligence and grace, and the way she navigated this overwhelming experience with such dignity and composure. The house staff moved quietly in the background, their presence a reminder of the different world Emily was entering. But Margaret was careful to introduce her as family rather than a guest, making it clear that Emily belonged here not as a visitor, but as an heir to everything the Whitmore name represented. Emily felt the weight of that legacy settling on her shoulders, understanding that accepting Margaret's love also meant accepting responsibility for carrying forward a family tradition of success and service that stretched back generations. The locket seemed to pulse with warmth against her chest as they moved through the mansion, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought her here and the mother whose love had made this reunion possible, even from beyond the grave. Margaret's voice was soft with emotion as she explained that the house had felt empty for so long, that all the beautiful things and comfortable spaces had seemed meaningless without family to share them with. But now, Emily's presence was already beginning to bring life and warmth back to rooms that had been preserved but not truly lived in for far too long. The day was drawing to a close as they settled in Margaret's private sitting room, a more intimate space filled with personal photographs and mementos that revealed the woman behind the business empire, the grandmother who had never stopped hoping for this moment of reunion and connection. Emily curled up in a chair that seemed to embrace her, feeling more at home than she had expected, despite the overwhelming grandeur of her surroundings, while Margaret poured tea from a service that had been in the family for generations, another small ritual of belonging and acceptance. They talked about practical matters and emotional ones, about Emily's job and her dreams, about Margaret's business and her plans for gradually stepping back from active management to spend more time with the granddaughter she had found again. Emily found herself sharing hopes and fears she had never voiced to anyone, feeling safe in the warmth of Margaret's attention and the unconditional acceptance that radiated from every word and gesture her grandmother made. Margaret spoke of her own dreams for their relationship, her desire to be not just a benefactor, but a true grandmother, someone Emily could turn to for advice and support and love, someone who would be present for all the milestones and celebrations that lay ahead. The locket caught the lamplight as Emily leaned forward, and both women were reminded once again of the miracle that had brought them together, the way love had found a way to transcend time and pride and all the obstacles that had kept them apart for so long. Margaret's eyes were bright with tears of joy as she looked at her granddaughter, finally understanding that the empty years hadn't been wasted if they had led to this moment of perfect connection and the promise of a future filled with the family love she had thought was lost forever. Subscribe to witness how Emily will navigate her new world of privilege while staying true to the values that shaped her, and how Margaret will learn to be the grandmother she always dreamed of being. The hours that followed passed in a blur of shared stories and tentative touches, Margaret and Emily sitting across from each other in the empty diner, as the world outside continued its relentless march, while time seemed to stand still within those four walls. Emily spoke of her childhood in foster care, the endless questions about her origins that had followed her like shadows, the way she had clung to the locket as her only tangible connection to a mother she had never known but had loved with every fibre of her being. Margaret listened with a heart that broke and mended with each revelation, her fingers tracing the worn surface of the table as she absorbed the magnitude of all the moments she had missed. All the birthdays and scraped knees and first days of school that had passed without her presence or knowledge. The weight of Margaret's wealth seemed insignificant compared to the poverty of connection that had defined both their lives. The billions in her accounts nothing more than cold numbers when measured against the warmth of Emily's hand finally resting in hers. They spoke of Sarah with voices thick with emotion, Margaret sharing memories of her daughter's laughter and dreams, while Emily revealed how she had always felt her mother's presence in quiet moments, a gentle whisper in her heart that had guided her toward kindness even when the world had shown her little in return. The locket between them seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a bridge across the chasm of years that had kept them apart, its simple gold surface reflecting the diner's fluorescent lights like captured starlight. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to flow down her cheeks. She spoke not of money or inheritance, though both would come in time, but of something far more precious, the chance to build a family from the ashes of loss, to create new memories that would honor Sarah's legacy while forging a bond that no amount of time or distance could ever break again. Emily's response came not in words, but in the way she leaned forward and placed the locket gently in Margaret's palm, trusting her grandmother with the most precious thing she owned, a gesture that spoke of forgiveness and hope and the unbreakable power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. 6 months later, the transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond the obvious changes that money could buy. Though Emily's new life bore little resemblance to her days of struggling to make ends meet in a cramped studio apartment. The mansion that had once echoed with Margaret's loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation, its grand rooms filled with the warmth of a family that had found its way back to wholeness through the mysterious workings of fate and the enduring power of love. Emily had left her job at the diner, though not before ensuring that her replacement would be treated with the same kindness she had always shown to every customer who walked through those doors, her generous spirit unchanged by the sudden abundance that had entered her life. Margaret had discovered that wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with, her billions finally finding their true purpose as she watched Emily pursue the education she had always dreamed of but never thought possible. The older woman had also established a foundation in Sarah's name, dedicated to helping young mothers in crisis, ensuring that no child would grow up wondering about their origins the way Emily had for so many years. Together, they visited Sarah's grave for the first time, placing fresh flowers on the headstone while Margaret whispered apologies to the daughter she had lost and promises to the granddaughter she had found, the locket once again resting around Emily's neck where it belonged. The diner still stood on the corner where their lives had intersected, though it now bore a small plaque that few customers noticed, commemorating the day when love had triumphed over pride and family had conquered the forces that sought to keep them apart. Emily often returned there, not as an employee, but as a reminder of how far she had traveled and how much further she intended to go, her heart full of gratitude for the grandmother who had given her not just material security, but something far more valuable. The knowledge that she was loved, that she belonged, and that sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Margaret would watch her granddaughter with eyes that sparkled with pride and joy, knowing that Sarah's legacy lived on in every kind gesture, every compassionate word, every moment of grace that Emily brought into the world, the locket around her neck catching the light like a promise that love, once lost, can always find its way home again.